When we find on postural examination that our client has a sagittal plane excessive tilt of the pelvis, perhaps an excessive anterior tilt, which is usually accompanied by a hyperlordotic lumbar spine, or perhaps an excessive posterior tilt, which is usually accompanied by a hypolordotic lumbar spine, or perhaps a kyphotic lumbar spine, then one possible reason for this is an asymmetrical baseline muscle tone of 4 possible groups of muscles. We have the anterior abdominal wall muscles in front. We have the low back extensor abdominal wall muscles in back. We have hip flexors in front, and we have hip extensors in back. The anterior abdominal wall muscles, we think of them as flexors of the trunk at the spinal joints, but they also pull the pelvis into a posterior tilt. Similarly, the extensors at the hip joint, such as the glutes and hamstrings, we think of them extending the thigh at the hip, but they also pull the pelvis into a posterior tilt. Conversely, the low back extensor muscles, we think of them as extending the trunk at the spinal joints, but they pull the pelvis into an anterior tilt. And similarly, the hip flexors that we think of as flexing the thigh at the hip joint pull the pelvis into an anterior tilt. So we have anterior tilters at the hip flexors and anterior tilters at the low back extensors, and posterior tilters at the anterior abdominal wall, flexors of the trunk, and posterior tilters for the hip joint extensors, glutes, and hamstrings. An asymmetry in the baseline tone of these muscles can cause our sagittal plane postural tilt distortion. Tight hip flexors, tight low back extensors, weak anterior abdominal wall, weak glutes could predispose toward excessive anterior tilt. Or tight, let's say, hamstrings, perhaps tight anterior abdominal wall, and weak hip flexors and weak low back extensors could predispose toward a posterior tilt postural distortion pattern of the pelvis.